Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the story of how the world's most popular desktop operating system evolved. It's a really fascinating history, full of huge leaps, some missteps, and constant reinvention.
So let's just start with a big question to get you thinking. What do you think is the single most influential user interface ever? Is it the home screen on your phone? Maybe the dashboard in your car? The web browser you're probably using right now?
You could make a really strong case that it's the Windows desktop. With its start menu, the taskbar, all those icons. But here's the thing. The interface that basically defined the personal computer for decades, well, it was a massive departure from where it all began.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to look at 5 key eras. We'll start at the very beginning with the first versions of Windows, then see the absolute revolution of the Start menu. We'll look at how XP brought stability and style, get into the slick age of Aero Glass, and wrap up with the big reinvention for touch and tiles.
Okay, let's kick things off way back in the 1980s. Back then, Windows wasn't even its own operating system. Nope. It was what you'd call a graphical shell that literally ran on top of MS-DOS, all designed to just make computers a little less intimidating to use.
The very first version, Windows 1, had this one super strict rule. Windows could not overlap at all. They were tiled, laid out side by side like tiles on a floor. But then, just 2 years later, Windows 2 comes along and makes this massive leap. It introduced stacking windows, and suddenly you could actually overlap them. You could resize them. You could drag them wherever you wanted. That sounds totally normal to us now, but back then, it was an absolute game changer.
And you know what's crazy to think about? Just how many things from that 1987 release are still with us? The minimize and maximize buttons? Yep, they showed up right here. And that keyboard shortcut you instinctively hit to close a program that's frozen? You guessed it. Alt plus F4 has been a part of Windows since version 2.
All right, now we're building towards what is, honestly, probably the single most important moment in the entire history of Windows. This wasn't just another update. This was a complete teardown and rethinking of how people should interact with a computer.
So before 95, if you wanted to launch an app in Windows, you had to open this thing called the Program Manager. It was basically just a big window filled with icons. But Windows 95 came along and just threw that entire concept in the trash. It introduced the holy trinity of the modern desktop, the desktop itself for your files, the Start button to find your apps, and the taskbar to see everything that was running. This was a gigantic shift. It moved us out of a simple program launcher and into the desktop-focused world that we, for the most part, still live in today.
Let's just focus on the taskbar for a second, because it was a stroke of genius. Before this, trying to juggle a few different programs was, well, it was a clumsy mess. The taskbar made multitasking visual. It made it obvious. Every single program you had open had its own little button right there at the bottom. You could see your whole workflow at a glance and jump between things with just one click.
And Windows 95 was also just packed with all these small but brilliant quality of life upgrades. It's what gave us that dedicated X button in the corner to close a window. It gave us the recycle bin, which has saved all of us from accidentally deleting important files countless times. And for the first time, you could just glance at the corner to see the time, and you could finally have different user profiles on one family computer.
All right, moving on from the 90s. The next huge leap forward happened when Windows finally decided to merge its home and business versions. And this was more than just a paint job. It was a fundamental change to the very heart of the system, bringing in rock-solid stability and a fresh new look.
So, why was Windows XP so legendarily stable? Well, the secret ingredient was something called the NT kernel. See, all the previous home versions were built on this really old foundation, MS-DOS. XP was the first one for regular consumers that was built on the modern, much more robust NT system that businesses were using. And the result for us? Way fewer of those dreaded blue screens of death. The system just worked. And of course, you can't talk about XP without talking about the look. It completely retired that old, boxy, gray interface we'd had for years and introduced the iconic Luna theme. All of a sudden, the desktop just popped with color. You had that bright blue, almost bubbly taskbar, that famous green Start button, and those playful red, yellow, and blue window buttons. It felt friendly, it felt modern, and it totally defined the look of computing for a whole generation. So next up, Windows enters what I'd call its most glamorous phase. The focus really shifted from pure function to include form, and it delivered this super sophisticated premium look that was all about transparency and light.
This was the Aero era. It all kicked off in 2006 with Windows Vista, which introduced the Aero Glass theme. Window borders suddenly became translucent and shiny, almost like polished glass. Then, in 2009, Windows 7 took that exact look, refined it, made it run a whole lot faster, and added brilliant little features like Aero Snap, that thing where you can just drag a window to the side of the screen and it snaps perfectly into place.
But really, the bigger story during this time was the evolution of the taskbar again. The Vista taskbar still mostly worked like it did back in '95, with text labels next to the icons. But Windows 7 gave us the Superbar. It smartly combined your pinned shortcuts and your running apps into single, clean icons without any text. This just tidied up the whole interface, and with the addition of jump lists to quickly get to recent files, it made the taskbar way more powerful.
So our final chapter here is one of really dramatic and, let's be honest, pretty controversial reinvention. The explosion of smartphones and tablets on the scene forced Microsoft to completely rethink Windows for a brand new world of touchscreens.
And this brings us to probably the biggest gamble in the history of Windows. With Windows 8, they completely ripped out the Start menu, a feature that had been the anchor of the OS for 17 years. In its place, the Start screen, a full-screen, touch-first grid of live, dynamic tiles. It was a bold, radical move designed for a new class of hybrid devices.
But for so many people who had used Windows for years, the change was jarring. You'd land on the desktop, and there was just no Start button to click. Basic things like shutting down your PC were suddenly hidden away in this new, confusing thing called the Charms bar, and it just felt disjointed. You were constantly being thrown back and forth between the new full-screen apps and the old, familiar desktop.
Now, to their credit, Microsoft really listened to the feedback. The very next update, Windows 8.1, was a huge course correction. It started to blend the old and the new. The Start button came back to the taskbar. They added an option to boot straight to the desktop again. And those new apps, they got familiar things like a title bar and a close button, which made them feel way more at home.
This whole hybrid idea really came together in Windows 10, which brought back a proper, powerful Start menu but cleverly integrated the live tiles from Windows 8 right inside it. And that leads us to where we are now, with Windows 11, which has refined the whole experience even more, with softer, rounded corners, a centered taskbar by default, and a simplified Start menu that favors clean, pinned icons over those busy live tiles.
But you know, through all of those changes, all those decades of evolution, some things have just stuck around. They're like the core DNA of Windows. The whole idea of the desktop for your files, that X button to close a window, the right-click menu, and even keyboard shortcuts like Alt plus F4. They all connect the very latest version of Windows all the way back to its earliest days.
So this entire journey leaves us with one last fascinating thought to chew on. We've gone from tiled windows to glass windows to live tiles. Now, as our main way of interacting with computers starts to shift again towards voice and VR and AI, what do you think the next window into our digital world is even going to look like? Thanks for watching.